The sun bled crimson across the western prairie as evening claimed the land. Nora Daly stood beside a rutted wagon trail, her calico dress torn and stained with days of desperate travel, feeling failure settle into her bones like mortal illness. Behind her, perhaps 100 yards down the slope, lay the wreckage of a wagon, tilted on its shattered axle. 2 oxen dead, and bloating flies forming a black, humming cloud. She looked at her children and felt her heart break. Nellie, 9 years old, stood with her mother's brown hair hanging lank, her father's stubborn chin lifted despite exhaustion. Paul, only 7, swayed where he stood, fever-bright eyes staring at nothing. Their feet were wrapped in strips torn from Nora's petticoat, but blood still seeped through. In her palm lay the last crust of bread, hard as stone and barely enough for 1 child. She'd been rationing it for 3 days, watching her babies grow weaker by the hour. Nora had tried everything. She'd spent hours trying to repair the axle before admitting defeat. She'd attempted to butcher the oxen, but the meat spoiled within hours. She'd tried flagging down the few riders who passed, but they'd spurred their horses faster, as if poverty were plague. Now, with sunset approaching and coyotes gathering on the ridgeline, Nora understood they would not survive another night. Paul's fever was climbing toward delirium. Nellie's lips had cracked so deeply they bled, and Nora herself felt the edges of her vision darkening. The thought came slowly, painfully, her children might survive if someone else took them. Anyone would be better than dying here beside rotting animals. Nora knelt in the sharp stones and took Nellie's small hand, holding it out toward the empty horizon like an offering. "Take my children," she whispered. "Someone, anyone, please." The sound of hoofbeats came softly at first. Then a shadow separated from the gathering twilight, a man on foot, leading a bay gelding. As he drew nearer, Nora saw he was Cheyenne buckskin leggings, faded cotton shirt, wide-brimmed hat with a hawk feather. Glass beads and carved bone adorned his horse's bridle. A bow rode beside a brass-framed Henry rifle. His weathered face was perhaps 35 years of age, dark eyes sweeping over the scene and registering everything. Some called him Little Bear Cheyenne, named to be finalized Little Bear in Cheyenne, though whites who knew of him called him Yellow Elk. He stopped 15 feet away, studying them. His gaze moved from Nora's face to the children, noting the fever, the wounds, the trembling hand still extended. "Take my children," Nora said again, forcing the words past cracked lips. "They're good children. They won't complain. Just give them water. Please." Little Bear studied her, seeing past desperation to iron will that hadn't broken. When he spoke, his voice carried careful Cheyenne-accented English. "I'll take you too." Nora's breath stopped. "What? All of you?" He moved forward slowly and unslung a water skin. He knelt before Nellie. "Cup your hands, little one." Nellie looked at her mother. Nora nodded, stunned, and watched as Little Bear poured liquid into her daughter's palms. Nellie drank like someone drowning. He refilled her hands twice before moving to Paul, steadying the boy's shaking wrists. Then he turned to Nora. She tried to refuse, but he shook his head firmly and held the skin to her lips himself. When he pulled it away, she whispered through tears why everyone else rode past. "Because you asked. And because leaving you here would diminish what it means to be human." Before she could respond, a new sound cut the air, distant yipping of coyotes. Then something worse, dust rising from the East Riders, coming fast. Little Bear's head snapped around his body, going still. "How many men hunt you?" Nora's stomach clenched. "Kingsley Harrow's crew. They burned our homestead 2 weeks past, shot my husband for a land deed he'd hidden. They've been tracking us ever since." Little Bear didn't waste breath. He lifted Nellie onto the horse, then Paul behind her. Hold tight to the mane. Don't let go. Shots cracked across the prairie, wild shots meant to terrify. Stay close and move fast, Little Bear said. Can you run? I'll crawl if I have to. Then run. Now. They ran. Nora stumbled after him, legs shaking, lungs burning. Behind them, men whooped and hollered. More shots kicked up earth, deliberately missing playing with them. Little Bear led them down a crumbling embankment into a dry arroyo. The horse balked, but Little Bear spoke in flowing Cheyenne, and it followed. They pressed under twisted willows as hoofbeats thundered overhead. Voices drifted down. Lost the trail somewhere. Let the rattlers have 'em. They'll be dead by morning anyway. The hoofbeats faded. Little Bear waited until satisfied, then scanned the ridgeline. They'll come back at sunrise. We need distance. That night, huddled under a wool blanket Little Bear carried, Nora felt his shoulder pressed against hers. She understood that survival had become a shared burden. For the first time since Thomas's murder, she closed her eyes and slept without dreaming of death. They walked west at first light, when air still held coolness, before the sun turned the prairie into a furnace. The land stretched hostile in every direction, broken only by distant black mesa wavering on the horizon. Nora Daly was 30, a farmer's wife turned widow. Thomas had died 3 weeks ago, shot by men wearing Kingsley Harrow's brand, left to bleed out while she'd hidden the children. He'd sewn the land deed into her morning coat's lining, knowing Kingsley would come for it. Why does Kingsley want your land? Little Bear asked as they walked. Our claim at Clay Bank sits where a spring feeds the creek year-round. Thomas discovered the boundary overlaps with old Cheyenne treaty land, meaning we share legal rights. Kingsley wants exclusive control so he can charge whatever he likes. Little Bear's jaw tightened. That creek feeds my people's encampment. This summer's been the driest in 60 winters. Without that flow, children and elders will die. Then we stop him, Nora said fiercely, for both our people. He glanced at her and something passed between them, recognition of shared purpose. He nodded. They stayed north of the main trail to avoid being silhouetted. By mid-morning, the heat was murderous. Little Bear led them to Dragonfly Creek, where he'd found seepage before. But when they arrived, the seep was fouled, oily sheen, covering the surface, dead jackrabbits bloating near the bank. Poison or disease, Little Bear said. We can filter and boil. It's risky, but thirst is certain death. He soaked cloth in the fouled water, wringing it drop by drop into a tin cup. He set it in direct sunlight to boil. The process took over an hour of watching her children wilt in meager shade. When it cooled, Nora let the children sip first tiny swallows to avoid cramping. We need to reach Lonesome Trail by nightfall, Little Bear said. There's a school teacher named Violet Hart. She has no love for Kingsley. She'll help. They'd gone perhaps an hour when Little Bear stopped suddenly. Dust rose southeast, 2 riders following their tracks. How far to cover? Nora asked. Not far enough. He pointed to dark basalt cutbanks jutting from the earth. There. The rocks will hide us. They ran. When they reached the cutbanks, Little Bear built a decoy fire to draw attention, then led them deep into the labyrinth of volcanic stone. The passages were narrow, barely wide enough for the horse. They crawled through the tightest sections, sharp edges scraping skin. Nora heard riders' overhead boots scuffing stone, one cursing the heat. Kingsley's gonna skin us if we come back empty-handed. Then we don't tell him. We say they headed into Black Mesa country. They laughed and rode on. Little Bear waited 20 minutes before whistling softly. The horse returned immediately. How did you teach it that? Nora asked. Trust, Little Bear said simply. The horse knows I won't lead it into danger I wouldn't face myself. By the time they reached Lonesome Trail, the sun was setting. The shanty belonged to Otto Klein, a German homesteader with scarred hands. When he saw them, he set aside his harness work and called toward the door. Violet, we have company, and they look like they've been dragged through hell. Violet Hart appeared tall, rail-thin, with ink-stained fingers and steel-gray hair. She ushered the children inside without questions, settling them by the stove with bread and weak milk. Otto poured Nora coffee. You're the daily widow. Thomas was a good man. I'm sorry. He hesitated. I salvaged things from your wagon after Kingsley's men raided it the second time. There's a mourning coat among what I saved, kept everything safe under the floorboards at my claybank claim. Nora's breath stopped. That coat is mine. My husband hid something important in the lining. Then you'll be wanting it back. Come by when you're able. Violet leaned close. Kingsley Harrow has fenced off the main pump at Sapphire Springs, charges triple rate now. His foreman's got Deputy Deaf Dan bought. Dan hears fine when it suits him. She paused. There's also a wanted notice for you at the marshal's office, Little Bear. Says you murdered a ranch hand at Whirlwind Pass last spring. The man drew on me first. I defended myself. I believe you. But Kingsley doesn't care about truth. He wants you gone, the widow's land claimed, and anyone who might testify silenced. That night, Little Bear showed Nora how to wrap the blanket for warmth. She copied his movements with quick fingers, and he noticed the steadiness despite exhaustion. You learn quickly. I had to, Nora replied softly. Thomas was ill off in those last months. I learned everything alone, plowing, planting, hunting, defending. Learning became survival. Their eyes met across lamplight. Neither spoke, but understanding lived in the silence. Two people who'd learned the frontier demanded adaptation or death. They reached Sapphire Springs 3 days later, timing arrival for market day, when crowds offered anonymity. The settlement clung to existence, false front buildings, leaning drunkenly canvas tents, patched until more patch than canvas. The heart of everything was the pump drawing water from deep underground. A line stretched 50 people deep. Guards flanked the pump, 4 hard-faced men wearing Kingsley's brand. A painted board listed the fee $3 per barrel. Nora's stomach dropped. I don't have $3. I don't have 3 cents. We'll find another way, Little Bear said quietly, studying the guard's positioning with tactical precision. Deputy Deaf Dan stood near the pump-tarnished star, pinned crooked on his vest. His gaze swept the crowd until it landed on Little Bear. Recognition flashed. His lazy demeanor vanished. He smiled slow and mean. Well, well, if it ain't Yellow Elk himself, bold as brass. Didn't expect to see you, what with that murder warrant hanging over your head. The crowd shifted nervously. Little Bear's hand moved toward his rifle, but Nora grabbed his wrist. Not here, she hissed. Not with the children watching. What happened next unfolded with chaotic violence. Otto Klein stepped forward from the line. This spring sits on treaty land. The water's fed by rainfall that belongs to everyone. You got no right charging triple rate. Dusty Bill stepped from behind the pump house, a pick handle swinging loose. Old man, shut your mouth before I shut it permanent. I will not be silent. Otto reached for the pump handle. Dusty Bill swung hard. The handle caught Otto across the shoulders, driving him to his knees. Little Bear moved without thought, 3 strides stepping between them. He caught the second blow on his forearm, bone-jarring bone. Pain shot to his shoulder, but he didn't make a sound. He countered with a short elbow strike to Dusty Bill's ribs. Dusty Bill staggered back, wheezing, clutching his side. The crowd erupted into chaos. Deputy Deaf Dan drew his pistol, aiming at Little Bear's chest. "Don't you move, Indian, or I'll drop you right here." Nora saw it happening in horrible clarity, the hammer pulling back Dan's finger, tightening. She moved on pure instinct, grabbing the heavy pump chain with both hands. She yanked down with all her strength. The massive iron handle slammed upward, cracking Dan's extended wrist. The deputy howled. His pistol clattered to the earth. The crowd surged. Little Bear raised his rifle deliberately, but kept his finger outside the trigger guard. He wouldn't kill here, wouldn't give Kingsley the excuse. But his message was clear: push further at your peril. Then Rudolph Pike appeared, pushing through the crowd. He was a professional bounty hunter with a face like sun-dried apple. He unrolled a telegraphed warrant with theatrical flourish. $300, Pike called out. $300 for the man called Yellow Elk, wanted for murder at Whirlwind Pass. Any man wants to claim it, now's your chance. The crowd shifted with ugly intent. $300 was more than most would see in 2 years. Then Kingsley Harrow himself stepped onto the pump house balcony, a man in his 50s with silver hair, wearing a suit too fine for the frontier. When his cold gaze found Nora, his smile was thin as a knife blade. "Justice has caught up with you, Yellow Elk," Kingsley said smoothly. "And with Mrs. Daly as well. I believe we have unfinished business regarding your unlawful occupation of my property at Clay Bank." "It's not your property," Nora shouted. "My husband held legal deed, and you murdered him to steal it." Kingsley's smile never wavered. "Strong accusations from a desperate woman with no proof. Deputy Dan, despite your injury, I believe you have cause to detain these individuals." Little Bear grabbed Nora's arm. "We need to run. Now." They fled through smoke from an ash pit cutting across laundry lines. Boots pounded behind them, men shouting, someone firing wild shots. They reached the freight lane behind Lantern's End Saloon. Violet appeared from a side door, waving frantically. "This way, quickly." She unlocked her schoolhouse and shoved them inside, pulling dusty quilts over desks to hide them in the space beneath. They crouched in darkness, listening to Boots thunder past outside. Nora's breath came in panicked gasps. Little Bear's hand found her shoulder steady, warm, offering silent promise, "I'm here." She leaned into that touch for one heartbeat before checking on the children. They stayed hidden until noon, when the search moved outward and streets grew quiet. Violet brought them tepid water and jerky when certain the danger had passed. "You need solid proof," she said without preamble. "Something concrete to counter that warrant and break Kingsley's hold." "What kind of proof? Records? Documents?" "I heard the accountant Francis Doolin talking drunk at Lantern's End. Mentioned Kingsley keeps 2 ledgers, one for the tax collector, one for himself. The true ledger lists payments to Dan, bribes to officials, and records of water he's diverting illegally." She leaned forward. Francis seemed like he wanted someone to know. "Get that ledger and you can bury Kingsley legally." "Where does he keep it?" "His private office, 2nd floor above the pump house. There's an iron safe bolted to the floor, but Doolin has the combination." "Then we create a diversion they can't ignore," Little Bear said quietly. "Draw them away while we strike where they're not looking." They spent the afternoon planning. At dusk, Little Bear climbed the exterior wall using nailheads as handholds. He reached the 2nd floor window and peered inside, counting guards, noting the desk and safe. Francis Doolin shuffled in nervously, unlocked the desk drawer, checked something hastily, then locked everything and extinguished the lamp. Little Bear climbed down and reported. "We need Doolin's cooperation, or we need that key and the combination. There's no other way inside. I can create a distraction tomorrow, Nora said. The next morning, she stood in the public line, wearing a borrowed dress, a shawl pulled low to hide her features. When she reached the front, she swayed dramatically. I feel faint, she murmured, letting her knees buckle. Dusty Bill rushed forward to catch the fainting woman. While his attention was occupied, young Nellie slipped through the press of bodies, small, unnoticed, invisible in the way children are. Her thin hands reached through the narrow gap between weathered boards at the back gate and lifted the heavy iron bolt with agonizing slowness. Paul kept watch from his position, counting passing wagons aloud, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, his voice serving as both timing and warning. But disaster struck. Deputy Deaf Dan returned unexpectedly early, spotted the bolt hanging loose, and let out a bellow. Intruders back gate. They're trying to break in. Pike's posse charged through the schoolyard, boots crashing through desks. Little Bear grabbed both children and bolted for the freight yard exit. But complete disaster struck. Someone had overturned a heavily loaded freight wagon, blocking the alley completely. They were cornered. Otto Klein appeared like an avenging angel, shoving them behind his hay-loaded wagon. A thrown whiskey bottle caught him full in the face, splitting his cheek to the bone. Blood streamed into his beard, but the brave old man grinned fiercely. "Go now," he roared. "Run, I'll hold these bastards." They ran, hearts breaking, as they abandoned the courageous farmer, knowing they'd never forget his sacrifice. They escaped to Otto's modest claim on Clay Bank, running until Nora thought her lungs would burst. The plot was humble, a gnarled cottonwood marking the boundary. A rough sod cabin and a hand-dug well Otto had promised held good water. But when Little Bear lowered the bucket, it came up empty except for alkali powder and a dead beetle. "Dry," he said flatly. Nora wanted to scream, but she couldn't afford despair. The children needed her. She straightened her spine and said through gritted teeth, "Then we find it elsewhere, or we take back what was stolen." That night, cold wind howled through gaps in the sod walls. Little Bear quietly shrugged off his shirt and stuffed it into the worst gap. He settled in the doorway with his rifle across his knees, using his body to block wind from the sleeping children. Nora tried to protest. "You'll freeze." He shook his head. "The little ones need warmth more than I do. Sleep now. We have hard days ahead." She watched him in the darkness, this stranger who'd become their protector for no reason except basic human decency. Her throat constricted with emotion. She couldn't name gratitude, certainly, but also something warmer and more dangerous to her widowed heart. That night, she woke twice and crept to the doorway, tucking the blanket higher around his shoulders, her fingers lingering, memorizing the solid warmth of safety. He never stirred, but she thought he knew. At first light, they headed into the hills, following the parched creek bed upstream. Little Bear's reasoning was elegant. If the drought was natural, they'd find nothing but cracked earth. But if the water had been stolen by human greed, they'd have evidence. The terrain grew rough, rocky outcroppings, steep washes filled with loose scree. Nora laced her boots tightly and tore another strip from her dress to wrap the children's blistered feet. Paul was stronger today, his fever finally broken. He walked without complaint, though Nora saw him wince with each step. Nellie kept steady pace, her young face set with grim resolve that made her look decades older. "Why are we doing this, Ma?" Paul asked during a rest. "Why don't we just go somewhere else, somewhere those bad men can't find us?" Nora knelt beside him, brushing sweat-dampened hair from his forehead. "Because running doesn't stop bad men from hurting other people. If we don't stand against Kingsley, he'll just keep stealing and killing. Sometimes doing the right thing means doing the hardest thing, even when we're scared." "But we're just us," Paul said. "We're not important. We don't matter." "Everyone matters equally," Little Bear said quietly, crouching beside them. Your brave mother asked for help when she was desperate, and I answered because it was human. That's how we all survive, by helping each other when times are hardest. By refusing to let cruelty win. Paul considered this, then nodded slowly. Okay. I'll help however I can. Size matters far less than heart, Little Bear assured him. And your heart is plenty big. They pushed on, climbing higher into rough country. Near Whirlwind Pass, they discovered fresh barbed wire strung across the trail, 3 vicious strands stretched between posts. It was both message and trap. Little Bear knelt and studied disturbed ground. 4 men, possibly 5, waiting in the sage behind those rocks. They want us to either turn back or cut the wire and trigger their ambush. So what do? Neither. He pointed to a narrow wash running parallel to the trail. We go around and come at them from an unexpected direction. They were halfway through the detour when the first shot cracked. A bullet kicked up stone chips near Little Bear's boot, and he moved like lightning, grabbing Nellie and rolling her into the deeper wash, his body shielding hers. Nora pulled Paul behind a boulder as more bullets whined overhead, ricocheting with high-pitched screams that sent stone fragments flying. Little Bear returned fire methodically, his Henry rifle barking sharp reports. He wasn't shooting to kill, not with children present, but to suppress, to keep attackers' heads down. One-eyed Sam, a massive brute with a milky left eye and double-barrel shotgun, suddenly charged forward with an incoherent roar. He fired both barrels wildly as he came. Nora's hands shook as she drew the heavy Colt revolver Little Bear had given her. She'd killed rabbits and once shot a threatening coyote, but she'd never aimed at another human before. The weight felt completely wrong in her trembling grip. Breathe deeply and slowly, Little Bear said calmly beside her. Look down the barrel to the sight. Squeeze the trigger slowly. Don't jerk. She fired. The brutal recoil jolted her arms painfully, nearly tearing the pistol from her grip, and the bullet went wide, but close enough to graze Sam's shoulder. He cursed fluently, clutching the bleeding wound, and retreated into the brush. Nora stared at the smoking pistol, trembling violently. She'd shot a man, drawn blood from human flesh. Little Bear reloaded her pistol with practiced efficiency, then pressed it firmly back into her shaking grip. His dark eyes met hers with understanding and something like approval. You did well. You protected your son when you had to. That's all that matters. You're a warrior now, whether you wanted to be or not. She nodded mutely, and they pressed on through the rocks, while shooting died away behind them. But the high country wasn't finished with them. Edging under a high cliff face, they suddenly heard hoofbeats directly overhead. A rider, Dusty Bill, judging by his distinctive cursing, deliberately kicked loose a cascade of shale and loose rock. Stones rained down like deadly artillery. One particularly large stone struck Little Bear's injured shoulder with sickening impact. He went down hard, gasping in agony, his rifle clattering away across the stones. Nora pulled him desperately under a narrow overhang, her hands moving frantically to check for broken bones. His shoulder was swelling rapidly, the flesh already hot and tight, darkening with massive bruising. She tore another strip from her dress and bound the injury as tightly as she dared. Their faces were inches apart in the confined space, breaths coming fast and mingling, and for one suspended heartbeat, their eyes locked with sudden, unexpected intensity that had nothing to do with injury. I'm all right enough to continue, Little Bear said through gritted teeth, though strain tightened his voice. You're not all right by any measure, Nora replied bluntly. But you will be, because I won't accept any other outcome. We've come too far to fail now. He studied her determined face, seeing absolute refusal to break. and felt something shift deep in his chest, something he hadn't felt since his wife died in the cholera outbreak 5 winters past. You're far stronger than you believe, Nora Daly. Stronger than most men I've known. I learned strength from necessity, she said quietly, helping him to his feet and slinging his arm over her shoulders. My only teacher was brutal hardship. Now come on. We're not stopping until we find what we came for. That cold night brought another terror. A lone wolf found their camp drawn by the scent of blood. It circled slowly, methodically, yellow eyes glowing in firelight. The horse shied violently, stamping hooves and pulling at restraining reins. Little Bear, despite his pain, set an effective snare horsehair, woven into a nearly invisible loop, a bent sapling providing spring tension. He lured the wolf closer with quail bones, making small wounded sounds that mimicked injured prey. Nora held the horse's reins firmly, whispering continuously in a low, soothing tone to keep the terrified animal calm. The wolf crept closer, closer, its hot breath steaming close enough she could see its teeth and smell its rank scent. The trap snapped with a crack like a gunshot. The wolf yelped sharply and fled into darkness, dragging the broken snare behind with its leg caught. It didn't return, but Nora heard it howling all night, a sound that made her skin crawl. How did you stay so calm with that beast so close? Little Bear asked later, flexing his injured shoulder and wincing. Because I couldn't afford not to be calm, Nora said simply, staring into the dying fire. Fear is a luxury I don't have with children depending on me. Fear would have gotten us killed a dozen times already. They found the damning truth at dawn when light was clear and unforgiving. Hidden behind thick willows and tumbled rock, a fresh diversion ditch cut deliberately across the natural creek bed, 6 feet wide, expertly timber-lined with new planks, still oozing sap, stamped clearly every 20 feet with the burned initials KH for Kingsley Harrow. Precious water flowed steadily north through the artificial channel into large private holding tanks, while the natural public creek lay cracked and dried downstream, scattered with bleached fish bones. Little Bear took Nora's trembling hand and placed it firmly on the damp earth where the illegal ditch had been excavated. Feel that moisture, he said, his voice low and rough with controlled anger. That's your undeniable proof. Kingsley didn't just neglect the public good, he actively stole it for profit while people died. Nora's fingers pressed into the damp soil, and she felt something inside her crystallize into diamond-hard resolve. Then we take this evidence to an honest judge and bury that murdering bastard with his own greed. In a half-collapsed line shack at the headworks, they found Francis Doolin crawling across the floor on his belly, leaving a dark trail of blood. He'd been gut-shot. Kingsley's foreman had put a bullet in him to silence uncomfortable questions. Nora knelt beside him, immediately pressing her shawl to the terrible wound, but even her untrained eyes could see it was too late. The thin accountant was dying. Francis's watery eyes were surprisingly clear, despite the agony. "You're the Daly widow," he rasped painfully. "Yes, and I'm going to finish what my husband started. I swear it." "Good." Francis fumbled weakly in his blood-soaked coat pocket. He pulled out a small leather diary, pages dense with cramped figures. 2 ledgers, one for tax collector, one for Kingsley's real business. He pressed the diary into her hands. All in here, every bribe, every payoff, every theft. Dan gets 50 monthly. Crews paid to fence springs. "We'll use it," Little Bear promised solemnly. "We'll see justice done." Francis's laugh was wet and bubbling with blood. "Justice, that's a pretty lie." His fading eyes found Nora's face. "But I'll tell you truth before I go. Your husband, Thomas, he held a legal deed. Clay Bank land co-owned with the Cheyenne Nation. Old treaty from before territorial organization. He coughed violently and more blood came. Kingsley knew from the beginning. That's why he had Thomas murdered. And there's more. He struggled desperately. Thomas and Kingsley, distant cousins from the same family, same blood back east in Ohio. That's why Kingsley wanted it so badly. Family land, family pride, old feuds that followed them west. Nora's breath stopped, her world tilting. Cousins Thomas never mentioned. He was deeply ashamed. Francis said, his voice fading rapidly. Kingsley's father, disowned by the family, bad blood. Thomas had letters, in his personal papers explaining everything. In that strongbox he buried. His eyes began to glaze. I wasn't just Kingsley's accountant. I was secretly working against him. From the very beginning. Gathering evidence for months. Waiting for the right person brave enough to use it. His breathing grew shallow. The deed, sewn in your mourning coat. Otto has it safe. You're not just a victim running away, Mrs. Daly. You're a legal claimant with rights. And your Cheyenne friend? He's the witness to the ditch origin. Together, you can destroy him completely. He managed one last terrible smile. Do me one favor. Bury me proper, with a marker. And remember, his voice dropped to barely a whisper. If the flow runs where it should, men act better toward each other. He died as the sun cleared the ridge, the diary still warm in Nora's hands. The revelations crashed over her in overwhelming waves. Thomas and Kingsley, distant cousins, that explained the particular viciousness, the intensely personal nature of the vendetta that went beyond simple greed. Family feuds on the frontier were the worst kind, poisoned by old grudges carried across generations. And Francis, the quiet accountant everyone had dismissed as Kingsley's spineless lapdog, had been a secret hero all along. The twist settled into her bones with cold clarity. She wasn't just running for survival anymore, wasn't just a helpless victim. She was the rightful legal owner of disputed land, backed by federal treaty law and family connection through her dead husband. Little Bear, falsely branded a murderer, held the key to proving systematic theft. And Francis, dismissed and underestimated by everyone, had been gathering evidence with patient courage. Everything had changed. Absolutely everything. They buried Francis Doolin in a shallow grave, marked with stones, Nora whispering words over him that she remembered from her father's funeral. Then they turned south back toward Sapphire Springs, carrying the diary and their determination. The journey back was faster, but infinitely more dangerous. They needed to reach Otto's claim before Kingsley's men figured out where they'd gone. They traveled mostly at night, sleeping in hidden washes during brutal daylight heat. When they finally reached Clay Bank 3 days later, the smell hit them first, smoke old and acrid. Otto's cabin was nothing but ash and charred timber still smoldering. The cottonwood stood scorched, but stubbornly alive. And Otto Klein lay dead in the yard, in a pool of dried blood, 3 bullet holes in his chest, forming a tight group, still clutching Nora's mourning coat to his body, like he'd died defending it. Nora knelt beside him in the ash, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on her face. She closed his kind eyes with gentle fingers and whispered through her grief, "Thank you for your kindness. I swear I'll make your death mean something lasting." She took the coat from his stiff fingers, charred at the edges, reeking of smoke and heroic sacrifice, and felt along the lining until she found the hidden stitching. She tore it open, and the deed fell into her palm like salvation-yellowed paper-cramped legal writing signatures and official government seals marking shared ownership between Thomas Daly and the Cheyenne Nation dating back 20 years. Legal proof of rights that predated Kingsley's claim by 2 decades. Paul cried beside her dry, gasping sobs from a small body that had no water left for tears. Nellie stood silent and pale, her small fists clenched, white-knuckled, her young face twisted with fury that looked decades too old. "We will not let this good man's death be for nothing," Nora said fiercely, folding the precious deed and tucking it into her bodice against her heart where she could feel it with every breath. "Otto's sacrifice will count for something real and lasting. I swear it." They left Otto where he lay. For the moment there would be time for proper burial after justice was served, and rode hard for Sapphire Springs with the diary and deed clutched like weapons. But Rudolph Pike had anticipated their destination. He'd set an elaborate trap at Sable Junction, the crossroads where 3 trails converged, the perfect killing ground. 6 heavily armed men with rifles, all eager for bounty money. Little Bear read the ambush in seconds. He made his choice with the calm of a man who'd always known this moment would come. Dismounting slowly with hands visible, he called out clearly, "I'll come peaceful if you let the woman and children pass unharmed. They've committed no crime. This is between me and Kingsley." "Can't do that, Indian," Pike said with false regret. "Kingsley wants the widow too, and those brats as witnesses. Something about trespassing and making false accusations." "It's her property by legal right," Little Bear said. "Treaty and deed both say so. Any judge who isn't bought will confirm it." "Not how Kingsley tells it, and his word carries more weight than yours, murderer. Now drop that rifle real slow, or this gets messy and the young'uns watch their ma die first." Nora's mind raced desperately, searching for options. She couldn't let Little Bear surrender, they'd hang him before sunset. But 6 armed men against them. The mathematics were unforgiving. Then, unlikely salvation appeared, a freight wagon rumbling toward the junction loaded impossibly high, with salt pork barrels driven by a teamster half asleep on the bench. An idea desperate, foolish, but possibly brilliant bloomed in Nora's racing mind. "Hold tight," she whispered urgently to Nellie, then spurred her horse directly toward the approaching wagon at full gallop, waving her arms frantically. The teamster jerked violently awake, cursing in German, and hauled hard on the reins. The wagon team shied sideways, violently, barrels shifting and groaning, and the entire heavy rig lurched sideways directly toward Pike's positioned men. Nora slashed frantically at a critical hobble rope with Otto's knife, and 2 of Pike's horses broke free, instantly bucking and scattering the others in cascading chaos. In the resulting confusion, Little Bear broke for them at a dead run. Pike fired hastily, and the bullet grazed Little Bear's ribs deeply, leaving a burning line of fire. But he kept moving. They ran together as bullets kicked up deadly geysers around them, Paul clinging desperately to Little Bear's back. Nellie pressed against her mother's side. They reached Violet's schoolhouse as darkness fell pounding desperately on the door. Violet pulled them inside, and Dr. Percy Whitlock, a Civil War surgeon with hands steadier than his haunted eyes, suggested stitched Little Bear's side by candlelight. Bullet grazed the ribs, but didn't crack them, which is a miracle. Percy said clinically, "You'll live, though I wouldn't recommend more heroics for a while." He glanced at Nora. "I can testify before a judge. I treated Kingsley's hands 3 months back, significant burns, consistent with handling blasting powder. He claimed it was from clearing stumps, but stumps don't leave black powder residue under fingernails. I kept quiet then, because I was a coward. But I won't be quiet anymore." "Will you swear to it officially before Judge Hartley?" Nora asked, hardly daring to hope. "I will gladly swear to it," Percy said, his jaw setting. "I've been silent far too long. Let me finally do one good thing before I die drunk in some gutter." Before midnight, a brick crashed through the schoolhouse window. A rough voice bellowed through the darkness. "Come dawn, we burn you out like rats. Give up the Indian and the widow, or you all burn together." Percy didn't flinch, just continued cleaning his instruments. Violet loaded her deceased father's old double-barrel shotgun and set it by the door. Little Bear, despite his injuries, stood guard through the broken window with his rifle across his knees. Nora brought him weak coffee, wordlessly setting the tin cup by his boot. She sat close beside him, shoulder pressed against his in silent companionship, close enough to feel his warmth and steady breathing. Neither spoke. Words would have been inadequate anyway. They stayed that way until dawn painted the eastern sky pale gray, sharing silence, and something deeper than language could express something that felt dangerously like hope. A massive storm was building over Black Mesa, towering thunderheads piling higher into the atmosphere, their dark bellies flickering with lightning promising rain. Little Bear watched its approach with experienced eyes, and slowly, carefully, a desperate idea took shape. "We flood them out," he said simply. "We cut Kingsley's illegal gate and let the stolen water reclaim its natural course. The evidence will be undeniable. Everyone will see who's been stealing and why the creek ran dry. And if rain comes, the flood will be even more dramatic. Kingsley's men will try to stop us with deadly force," Violet said. "Let them try." Little Bear set his eyes hard as flint. "We have right and law on our side, and sometimes that's enough to win against power." They gathered what few allies they could find who were brave enough. Violet with her shotgun, Percy with his medical bag, an old army pistol, Otto's cousin Mabel, a formidable woman built like a draft horse and strong as two men, and Emil Rocha, the telegraph operator, who'd grown sick of watching Kingsley corrupt everything. The wire line reached Sapphire Springs last year. With Nora and Little Bear, they numbered only 6 against Kingsley's dozen armed men. The mathematics were virtual suicide. But they were done calculating odds and being afraid. They rode out at dusk, timing arrival for full darkness. The headworks loomed against the gathering storm, massive timber gates and engineered stone channels all stamped prominently with Kingsley's mark, all completely illegal under existing treaty law. Little Bear and Mabel attacked the main gate with grim determination, using a fence tool and heavy iron crowbar, prying at the heavy boards. Wood groaned loudly, nails shrieked, but the gate held stubbornly, built far too well. Lightning flashed brilliantly, turning the world white as noon for one frozen instant. In that moment of unnatural illumination, Nora saw Dusty Bill and 4 armed men emerging from the willows, like vengeful specters, rifles rising toward firing positions. "Get down now," she screamed, and everyone scattered. Bullets cracked viciously across the night muzzle flashes, blooming like deadly orange flowers in the darkness. Little Bear moved low and fast, despite his injuries, using rocks for cover, returning measured fire with careful precision. Percy fired once with shaking hands, old battlefield memories making his aim unsteady, but the bullet went wide. Dusty Bill charged forward like a maddened bull, roaring incoherently, completely insane with rage. Nora raised her pistol with both hands for stability. This time her hands were rock steady, her mind crystal clear, her aim true. She didn't aim for the charging man in poor light. Hitting a moving target in darkness was foolish. Instead, she carefully aimed for the critical retaining pin holding the massive gate closed, a small target barely visible in the lightning flashes, but the key to everything. She fired deliberately. The iron pin shattered into useless fragments. The gate burst violently outward with a roar, like the literal end of the world, thousands of gallons of pent-up water exploding through with unstoppable force, brown and foaming and absolutely devastating. Dusty Bill caught mid-charge in the wrong place, slipped helplessly in the sudden churning torrent. The massive gate, thousands of pounds of waterlogged timber, heavy iron fittings, and accumulated pressure crashed down on him with terrible final finality. He died instantly without even time to scream, crushed beneath the weight of his own master's greed. The liberated flow roared back into its ancient natural channel with primal force, carving deep and true foaming white, in the frequent lightning flashes reclaiming with violence what had always been its rightful path. But their work wasn't finished. Kingsley would simply call it vandalism unless they could get word to an honest judge immediately. Violet and Nora sprinted through darkened alleys while heavy rain began to fall in fat, cold drops, while Little Bear and Percy deliberately drew the bulk of Kingsley's forces on a dangerous wild chase through the stockyards, firing and moving, constantly staying just barely out of reach. Pike intercepted the women at the telegraph office, climbing the exterior ladder with murderous intent, planning to cut the wire before they could send anything. Nora grabbed a heavy iron door hook from the wall and swung it with all her remaining strength directly into Pike's exposed shin. The solid impact was deeply satisfying. Pike toppled from the ladder with a howl of genuine agony, landing hard in rapidly forming mud, his leg bending at an unnatural angle that suggested broken bone. Inside the small office, Violet's skilled fingers flew over the telegraph key with impressive speed, tapping out their desperate message in clean Morse code. Kingsley Harrow systematic theft, stop murder and bribery documented, stop deed proof and ledger evidence, stop send Judge Hartley. Immediately stop lives in danger, stop. Rain hammered the thin roof now with deafening force. Emil sent the crucial message 3 times to ensure it penetrated the growing storm static. Judge Hartley's an honest man with a reputation for fairness. Emil shouted over the rain's roar. If he receives this, he'll come with territorial authority. I'd stake my life on his integrity. But the final confrontation still waited at Kingsley's private tanks. The corrupt landowner fled to his fenced compound, but he didn't go alone. Somehow in the chaos, his men had captured young Paul. Nora's entire world stopped when she saw her precious son, small, terrified, soaking wet and shaking, held roughly by the collar. In Kingsley's iron grip, a pistol pressed firmly to his small temple. "Call off your dogs immediately." Kingsley shouted desperately across the wire fence, lightning illuminating his face in stark, hellish flashes that revealed raw fear beneath the cultured exterior. "Call them off right now, or I paint this ridge with the boys' brains. I swear before God, I'll do it." Nora couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her baby, her surviving son, the one precious person in this entire world she would burn everything down to protect, and he was in a monster's hands with a gun to his head. Little Bear raised one hand, slowly signaling everyone to hold fire. When he spoke, his voice was preternaturally calm, and the impossible calm that came only from absolute control over primal fear. "Release the boy, Kingsley. Whatever is between us, he's innocent. This is between you and me. Let him go, and I'll trade the evidence diary deed, everything you want." "No, you can't." Nora gasped desperately, but Little Bear ignored her. Kingsley's eyes gleamed with triumph and madness in the lightning flashes. "Put them on the ground slowly. Step back 10 paces. Do it now." Little Bear reached slowly into his shirt with deliberate movements, as if preparing to comply. That's precisely when young Nellie moved with courage beyond her years. She'd been circling patiently through the shadows, small and unnoticed, using the drainage culvert Little Bear had spotted during reconnaissance, just barely wide enough for a determined child. She erupted from the darkness like a vengeful spirit and grabbed her brother's thin arm with both small hands, yanking him backward with all her desperate strength. Kingsley's grip slipped just enough in his surprise. He fired reflexively, the muzzle flash blinding. The bullet grazed Paul's ear, a burning line that drew blood and would leave a permanent scar, and the boy screamed in pain and terror. But he was alive, still breathing, still whole. Nora moved without conscious thought, running parallel to confuse Kingsley's aim, deliberately making herself a target to draw fire away from her children. Percy surged forward bravely and cut a critical fence tether with his knife, and the corner post collapsed with a groan, bringing down an entire section of wire in a deadly tangled mass. Little Bear closed the distance in 3 powerful strides, ignoring the white-hot agony in his injured ribs and shoulder, and punched Kingsley square in the jaw with every ounce of strength and righteous fury he possessed. The impact lifted the older man completely off his feet. Kingsley stumbled backward, his expensive boots catching hopelessly in the fallen wire, and he fell directly into the open inspection hatch of his own holding tank with a splash. Then he surfaced once, gasping and clawing desperately at the slick metal walls for purchase his fine suit and heavy boots, dragging him down like lead weights. Then the black water closed over his silver head, completely swallowing him whole, and he didn't come up again. His own stolen resource became his grave and final judgment. Pike, his leg clearly broken and useless, raised his rifle one-handed toward Little Bear's unprotected back, ready to collect his blood money bounty, even if it meant witnessed murder. But Violet's voice cut through the rain and chaos like a sword of justice. "Judge is coming. Telegraph went through clear. You shoot now, Pike, and you'll hang for murder before the week ends." Pike froze completely, his mercenary mind calculating rapidly. He looked at the telegraph office lights blazing through the rain, saw the town bell ringing frantically as people rushed toward the flooding creek, in wonder saw the tide of history turning decisively against everything Kingsley had built. Slowly, painfully, he lowered the rifle. "This ain't over," he muttered. "Kingsley's got kin back east with money and lawyers. They'll want revenge. Let them come whenever they want," Little Bear said coldly. "We'll be ready and waiting." Pike limped away into the rain and darkness, and no one moved to stop him. Some men simply weren't worth the bullet. Nora reached Little Bear through the downpour, her muddy hands finding his face, framing it with desperate gentleness, holding him steady as Paul sobbed against his hip, and Nellie clung to them both with fierce desperation. He bent his head until his forehead rested gently against hers, and they stood there breathing together in the rain for one perfect earned moment that needed absolutely no words. They'd won. Against impossible odds, against entrenched power and systematic corruption, against wealth and violence, they'd actually won. The liberated flow filled every trough and cistern and stock tank in Sapphire Springs and beyond. Cattle lowed in profound relief, finally able to drink their fill. People stumbled from their homes in nightclothes, staring in absolute wonder at the creek running clear and strong for the first time in 8 long months, and many wept openly with relief and joy. Judge Alphonse Hartley arrived at dawn with territorial authority, his wagon axle deep in mud, 2 grim deputies riding beside him with rifles and law. The judge was tall and imposing, with iron-gray hair and penetrating eyes that missed nothing. Emile met him at the telegraph office and handed over the transcribed message. Percy presented his testimony about Kingsley's blasting powder burns with clinical precision. Violet laid out Francis Doolin's diary pages, marked with documented evidence of systematic bribery and theft. Nora swore a formal oath and presented the deed, treaty-backed, legally binding, predating Kingsley's claim by 20 years. She also presented the letters from Thomas's buried strongbox, proving the family connection between her murdered husband and Kingsley, explaining the particular viciousness of the feud. Judge Hartley listened to everything in absolute silence, his granite face revealing nothing. Then he ordered the pump house thoroughly searched. They found the second ledger behind a false panel exactly where Francis had indicated amounts, dates, names, locations, all meticulously recorded in Kingsley's own handwriting. The evidence was damning comprehensive and utterly unassailable. Deputy Deaf Dan tried desperately to flee at first light. But Glass-Eye Joe, the liveryman, who owed Percy an unpayable debt for saving his son's arm after a wagon accident, tripped Dan efficiently with a broom handle. Dan went down hard in the mud, cursing. Judge Hartley personally stripped the tarnished star from Dan's vest and had him clapped in iron manacles. "You'll stand trial for corruption accessory to murder conspiracy to deprive citizens of their rights and bribery of a federal official. The judge set his voice cold as winter iron. "And if justice prevails as I intend, you'll spend the rest of your miserable days breaking rocks in territorial prison." Dan's ruddy face went gray with the realization that his comfortable corruption had finally caught up with him completely. Pike had vanished during the night, smart enough to know when the game was lost. But Judge Hartley issued a formal territorial warrant, and marshals would be hunting him within days. The frontier was shrinking. There were fewer places for men like Pike to hide successfully. The costs of their victory were tallied in grief and permanent scars that would never fully heal. Otto Klein was buried under his beloved cottonwood, with full frontier honors befitting a hero. Mabel carved a wooden marker with patient care, Otto Klein. He helped strangers when others turned away. A good man in hard times. Half the town attended the simple service, and Nora wept openly and without shame. Francis Doolin was buried beside Otto with equal honors, his grave marked with words from his own diary that became the town's motto: if the flow runs where it should, men act better. Violet's window remained deliberately broken through that entire winter, a conscious reminder that justice came with a price, that standing up to corruption required real sacrifice. Paul's ear healed, crooked the scar tissue, pulling it slightly forward. But he wore the mark with quiet pride, visible proof he'd survived something terrible, proof he'd been brave when it mattered most. That night, with beds full of sleeping children and exhausted friends, Little Bear laid his blanket across the threshold of Violet's schoolhouse and slept sitting upright against the door hat, pulled low rifle within easy reach. Nora woke 3 times in the darkness. Each time she rose silently and tucked the blanket higher around his broad shoulders, her fingers lingering longer, each time tracing the solid strength of him, memorizing the shape of safety. The 3rd time, his hand caught hers gently in the darkness. "You should sleep and rest," he said softly, his thumb moving across her knuckles in a slow caress that was both question and answer. "So should you," she whispered back, her voice catching. Their eyes met in the darkness, faces barely visible in the faint moonlight through broken glass, and something unspoken but powerful passed between them, understanding promise. At the beginning of something neither was quite ready to name aloud, but both felt growing stronger with each shared danger and victory. His fingers tightened on hers with gentle pressure. "I'm glad I found you on that road when I did. I'm glad I asked for help instead of giving up," she replied, her throat tight. "I'm glad you answered when no one else would." They sat that way until dawn, hands clasped firmly, a connection forming that would prove stronger than any legal document or spoken vow, forged in fire, tested by hardship, genuine and true. Weeks blurred into months. A work crew formed, half townsfolk, half Cheyenne, from Standing Bear's northern encampment, and they rebuilt the creek system properly, with engineered stone splash pools designed to prevent future theft while maximizing fair distribution. Barriers between white settlers and Cheyenne began to slowly erode as they worked side by side, passing tools and drinking from the same canteens, learning each other's names and stories. Children played together while their parents worked, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, 2 separate communities became one. Judge Hartley awarded formal, legally binding guardianship of Sapphire Springs to Nora Daly as Thomas's legal successor, and to the Cheyenne Nation, under the old treaty, Percy had located the original document moldering in territorial archives, its ink faded, but its legal force intact. The pump house became a public trust managed by an elected committee of 7, Violet Emil Standing Bear, Mabel Nora Percy, and Glass Eye Joe. The life-giving flow ran freely again, and with it came renewed life. Gardens sprouted in previously barren yards. Children's laughter returned to the streets. Cattle fattened on good grass. The town, which had been slowly dying under Kingsley's stranglehold, began to breathe and grow and hope again. Little Bear's murder charge was formally dropped. 4 witnesses from Whirlwind Pass came forward, men who'd seen the ranch hand draw first, without provocation, who'd stayed silent from fear, but found courage in Kingsley's fall. Judge Hartley personally tore the wanted poster in half with his own hands and gave the pieces to Little Bear as a symbolic gesture. "You're a free man with full rights restored." The judge said, his stern face softening slightly. "But understand, Kingsley has family back east, with money and lawyers and long memories. And Pike's still out there somewhere. Watch your back constantly, and if you need help, send word to my office." Little Bear took the torn poster and nodded once. "I always watch my back. The frontier taught me that lesson young." He didn't stay in town permanently. That had never been his nature. But he didn't leave either. Didn't return to his band's northern encampment and resume his old solitary life as if nothing had changed. He and Nora built something together, something practical and unspoken, rooted in shared survival and deep mutual respect. She held the clay bank claim legal and clear and undisputed now, and began rebuilding the cabin with help from both white homesteaders and Cheyenne families who donated labor freely. Little Bear constructed a proper corral beside it, strong enough to hold horses through winter storms, and began teaching Paul to ride bareback in the cool dawn hours. The boy took to it with natural grace that made Little Bear smile genuinely, his laughter carrying across the prairie for the first time since his father's murder, bright and clear and alive with joy. Nellie flourished under Violet's patient tutelage, learning to read and cipher and write in a clear, confident hand. She never spoke of the night she'd crawled through that culvert to save her brother. But sometimes Nora caught a shadow crossing her daughter's face and knew the memory lingered sharp as broken glass. Frontier custom dictated strictly that a widow wait 1 full year before remarrying, and Nora had no intention of violating that expectation, even if she'd wanted to. But she and Little Bear built something that needed no legal sanction or public ceremony, a partnership of equals who protected each other and the children with fierce, unwavering dedication. He hunted, keeping them supplied with fresh meat. She tended the claim, planting and harvesting and planning for winter. They worked together in companionable silence that needed no words, developed routines and rhythms that felt natural as breathing. When the first hard frost came in October, painting the prairie silver and killing the last wildflowers, Nellie presented Little Bear with his carefully mended shirt. She'd worked on it secretly for weeks, stitching with patient care beyond her years. At the cuff gleamed a single blue trade bead that caught the lamplight. "Ma told me blue means the flow from the spring," Nellie said, looking up at him with serious eyes. "I wanted you to have it so you'd remember what we fought for. So you'd remember us if you ever have to leave." Little Bear studied the bead silently, turning the shirt slowly in his hands, his throat tight with emotion he had no adequate words to express. He looked across the cabin at Nora, and she met his gaze steady, sure, offering something without demanding anything in return. This was not a vow, not yet. But it was a promise, the slow frontier kind built on trust and shared hardship, and something deeper than romance. The kind that lasted because it was rooted in reality rather than fantasy. 3 months later, when deep winter held the land, Pike was captured in Denver by territorial marshals and returned in chains. He stood trial for attempted murder conspiracy and flight from justice. The jury deliberated less than an hour before convicting him on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 years hard labor at the Territorial Penitentiary. Deaf Dan received 20 years for corruption and accessory to murder. Neither man would likely survive their sentences. Prison was brutal and unforgiving. Justice, slow and imperfect, had been served. The final revelation came that spring when Mabel was salvaging the last items from the Dailies' original wagon wreckage. Deep beneath charred wood and scattered belongings, she unearthed a buried tin strongbox that the raiders had somehow missed. Inside were Thomas's personal papers, land surveys, letters to Standing Bear discussing shared resource management with respect and equality, and a hand-drawn map marking a second unrecorded spring under Platinum Pass that no white settler had ever documented. He kept it secret deliberately. Nora realized, unfolding the map with trembling hands. He wanted to protect Cheyenne access first, even before white settlement. He was honoring the treaty in spirit before the law ever recognized it, in fact. He was a better man than I knew. Sharing the map meant safe summer pasture for both white homesteaders and Cheyenne bands, binding their futures together in ways that transcended property lines and legal documents. It was Thomas's legacy, generosity, and foresight that outlived his murder and offered genuine hope for lasting peace. On the last page of Francis Doolan's diary, written in a steady hand before fever and infection took him, were the words that became the town's official motto, carved into a plank above the pump house entrance: if the flow runs where it should, men act better. Nora tore out that page and kept it folded in her apron pocket like a sacred talisman. When Little Bear rode out before dawn to hunt his bow and rifle silhouetted against the rising sun, his figure growing smaller across the vast prairie, she touched the paper and waited calmly, no longer fearing he wouldn't return, because she knew with certainty he always would. When he did return hours later, he placed fresh backstrap on her kitchen table without fanfare. "Cold night coming," he said simply, brushing prairie dust from his shirt. "Thought you'd want to cook inside where it's warm." She poured him coffee from the pot she'd kept warm all morning, cleared space for his hat on the peg beside the door, the peg that had become his through unspoken agreement. "Then we'll be ready for it. Together." Their eyes met over the rising steam. No vows spoken yet, no grand declarations made. Just quiet, earned understanding that they would face whatever came next as partners. Paul burst through the door with a gust of cold air, breathless and grinning. "Little Bear, Standing Bear says the creek's running full enough for winter fish. He's teaching ice fishing next week. Can we go, please?" Little Bear looked at Nora, and she nodded, smiling, with something that felt remarkably like happiness. "Go. Learn everything you can. I'll have hot stew waiting when you return, frozen and victorious." She watched them leave together, her son and the warrior, who'd saved them all, walking side by side toward the creek that flowed clear and strong again, their voices carrying back on the cold wind. Nellie sat at the table practicing her letters with fierce concentration, and Nora felt something she hadn't felt since before Thomas died: genuine peace. Not the absence of struggle, the frontier would never grant that luxury, but the peace of knowing they'd fought for something meaningful and won. The peace of community restored. The peace of children safe and growing strong. The peace of finding, against all odds and expectations, someone trustworthy to share the burden of survival. That evening, as winter stars emerged brilliant and cold, Little Bear returned from Standing Bear's camp. He'd been invited to stay permanently, to return to his people and resume his old life. He'd considered it seriously for days. But when he saw Nora standing in the cabin doorway with lamplight behind her and welcome in her eyes, his decision crystallized with perfect clarity. He dismounted and walked toward her, closing the distance with steady purpose. When he reached her, he spoke words he'd been carrying for weeks, but hadn't found the right moment to offer until now. "I stay," he said simply, his voice quiet but certain. "Not because I have to. Not because I think you need protection. I stay because I choose to. Because this—" He gestured at the cabin, the children visible through the window, the rebuilt life they'd fought so hard to preserve. "This is where I belong now. This is home." Nora's breath caught. And when the year of mourning ends in spring, we'll talk then about the future and what we want it to hold. His eyes held hers steadily with complete honesty. But know this truth, I'm not leaving unless you send me away. Whatever happens, whatever we become to each other, I'm staying. I won't send you away, she said, and it was both promise and certainty. I couldn't even if I wanted to. You're already part of us. And you're part of me, he said quietly. You have been since that first night in the arroyo, when you could have given up, but didn't. They stood together in the gathering darkness, not touching yet, but close, watching the first stars appear in the vast prairie sky. No kiss, no embrace that would wait for a more appropriate time, when mourning customs had been fully honored, and the future could be claimed without shame or whispered judgment. But the promise was made unbreakable, as the iron will that had brought them through hell and out the other side stronger. And that, in the unforgiving frontier of autumn 1878, America was a kind of miracle all its own.